Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and unpack them to find the most fascinating insights. Today we're plunging into a topic that is absolutely packed with misconceptions: sexuality in ancient Rome.
Yeah, when people hear ancient Rome, often the first things that come to mind are, well, images of excess, maybe orgies, a world where anything goes sexually.
Exactly. It's often reduced to, like, a caricature. But the stack of sources you've shared with us, everything from legal texts and literature to art and archaeological finds, they paint a much more complex and, frankly, surprising picture.
It's a world where norms and behaviors were vastly different from our own, challenging many modern assumptions about gender, desire, and social control. It really makes you think.
So our mission in this deep dive is to move beyond those simple caricatures and explore the actual attitudes, behaviors, and, the social norms that truly shaped Roman sexual life. What was okay, what was scandalous, and maybe most importantly, why. Let's dig in.
Absolutely. Let's start by directly challenging that common assumption of unlimited sexual license. While Roman sexual practices differ dramatically from later Western societies, the sources make it really clear that sex was not unregulated.
Not unregulated, so it wasn't just like total chaos.
Far from it. Roman life, including sexuality, was deeply governed by traditional norms and customs, what they called mos maiorum, literally the way of the ancestors. There was a powerful sense of propriety.
And a key concept regulating behavior was pudor, right? I've seen that mentioned.
Yes, pudor. It's often translated as shame or modesty, but it was a really important social virtue, a sense of appropriate behavior that went beyond just personal feelings. It was about maintaining one's reputation, your social standing.
So you could actually face consequences for violating these norms.
Oh, absolutely. There were legal restrictions on sexual transgressions throughout both the Republican and imperial periods. And what's really striking is that public officials, called censors, their job was to maintain citizen roles and rank. They could actually remove individuals from elite classes like senators or equestrians, specifically for sexual misconduct.
Wow, okay. That tells you it wasn't just social disapproval. It could actually, like, tank your political career.
It had very real consequences. Even modern scholars like Michel Foucault, looking back at the Greco-Roman world, emphasized that sex wasn't about total freedom, but about restraint and the management of pleasure. It was about control.
Which brings us to the foundational structure of Roman society. It was profoundly patriarchal, built around the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, who held immense power.
Yes, and Roman masculinity, virtus, was deeply tied to this power and control. Virtus comes from the word vir, meaning man, and it encompassed not just courage, but also self-discipline and the ability to govern others, including controlling sexual relations within your household and interactions outside it.
So a real man controlled himself and those beneath him, essentially. What was the ideal for women?
For women, the core ideal was pudicitia. This is often translated as chastity or modesty, but the sources show it was a more complex, kind of positive quality. It was about a woman's attractiveness combined with strong self-control, which was crucial for maintaining her family's honor and status. Elite women were expected to be strong figures managing the household.
Now, it's crucial to remember, isn't it, that most of the voices we hear from this period come from educated Roman men. So our understanding, especially of female sexuality or, the experiences of lower status people, is largely filtered through that elite male perspective.
That's a really, really important point to keep in mind as we look at the sources. It shapes everything.
And speaking of the sources, they highlight some truly striking differences from later Western norms that can be quite challenging to process initially. For example, Roman religion didn't see sexuality as inherently sinful and actually promoted it.
That's right. Sex and procreation were seen as vital for the prosperity and health of the state. It was integrated into religious thought, not opposed to it.
And prostitution. Completely legal, you said?
Legal, registered, and very much a public phenomenon, unlike in many later periods. Just part of the urban landscape.
And what about art? You mentioned art we might call pornographic, found in homes. That sounds surprising.
Yes, depictions that are extremely explicit by our standards were found in surprisingly respectable places on household walls, mosaics, even small objects. They weren't necessarily hidden away, they were part of the visual environment, particularly in private homes or places associated with pleasure, like, say, the baths.
Okay, here's a key insight that often surprises people. Roman attitudes towards attraction to teenaged youths of both sexes were vastly different. For men, attraction to adolescent boys was considered, well, unremarkable, natural.
But, and this is a critical Roman distinction, it was only truly acceptable if the younger male partner was not freeborn, Status was absolutely everything. That distinction is vital.
And tied to that status difference, the modern concept of homosexual or heterosexual identity simply didn't exist in the Roman world. There aren't even Latin words for these categories.
Right. The core distinction wasn't the sex of your partner, but the role you took in the sexual act. Were you the active penetrating partner or the passive penetrated one? For a free man, there was generally no moral censure for being active with a woman or with a lower status male, as long as it didn't show excess, weaken his self-control, or importantly, infringe on the rights of his peers.
So it was all about maintaining that masculine dominant role. Being perceived as effeminate, especially being the passive partner, was strongly denounced, particularly in political attacks, right?
Exactly. Taking the passive role was seen as weak and servile, compromising a free man's status, his libertas. Yet, moderate sex with male prostitutes or slaves was acceptable if the citizen was the active one.
Too much sex, though, was bad for anyone.
Hypersexuality was condemned in both sexes. It was a sign of lacking that all-important Roman self-control, that virtus.
And women generally faced stricter rules than men.
Yes, despite the positive ideal of pudicitia, moral codes for women were generally much more constrained, focused almost entirely within the bounds of marriage and reproduction.
Female relations are mentioned, but seem less visible in the sources we have.
Much less visible. The surviving literature is so dominated by male perspectives that female-female relationships are really poorly documented, although they do appear in some art. Interestingly, Roman gender boundaries overall were sometimes perhaps more fluid than in ancient Greece in certain contexts, but the documentation is sparse.
Okay, our sources point out that scholars often use a penetrated binary model to understand Roman sexuality. Is that helpful?
Yes, it's a useful framework for highlighting that active-passive distinction, and its crucial link to status.
Mhm.
But the sources do caution that it has limitations and doesn't capture the full complexity of individual experiences or expressions in Rome. It's a model, not the whole story.
And the very term sexuality itself is debated for antiquity.
It is, yeah. Some argue it imposes a modern concept, but lacking a better term to describe the cultural interpretation of erotic experience, it remains in use to discuss these topics.
So how do we actually find all this out? What kind of sources are we looking at that give us these insights?
Well, the sources fall broadly into things like legal texts, medical writings, various forms of poetry, and political discourse. A real mix.
And some types of writings spill the beans more than others, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Genres that had maybe lower cultural status in antiquity are often much more explicit things like comedy, satire, personal invective, love poetry, even stuff like graffiti, magic spells, inscriptions. High-status genres like epic poetry or philosophy are generally less revealing about the day-to-day reality.
And legal texts. We need to be careful how we read those, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily what people did.
Crucially careful. Legal texts tell us what the Romans wanted to regulate, prohibit, or encourage. They are a window into the ideals or maybe the fears of Roman society, not necessarily a perfect reflection of everyday behavior. Aspiration versus reality.
Got it. Okay. So who are some of the key Roman writers who actually talk about sex? Give us some names.
Well, way back in early comedy, you have someone like Plautus. His plays are just full of sex-related plots and humor, often involving young lovers and their, complicated schemes.
And Cato the Elder, the famously stern moralist. Seems unlikely.
Cato, paradoxically, actually offers glimpses into those earlier idealized norms regarding sexual conduct that he felt his contemporaries were abandoning. He's complaining, but it tells us what the ideal was supposed to be.
The philosopher Lucretius.
His big epic poem, De Rerum Natura, includes a really detailed discussion of Epicurean views on sex, contrasting sex for procreation with sex purely for pleasure.
Then we get to the end of the Republic with the poet Catullus. His work is known for its emotional rawness and, shall I say, pretty explicit language.
Catullus's poetry gives us a huge range, from incredibly tender love poems to extremely obscene attacks. The sources highlight his exploration of diverse erotic experiences, including relationships with boys. You see this in poems like his famous Carmen 16, which is, well, shockingly vulgar, or others exploring his feelings for young male companions. He doesn't hold back.
Cicero, the great orator, must give us some insights through his political battles.
Oh, absolutely. Cicero's speeches, especially when he's prosecuting someone in court, are full of attacks on opponents' personal lives, including their sexual conduct. This reveals what was considered scandalous or politically damaging in those elite circles. Plus, his letters are just packed with gossip.
Moving into the imperial era, The elegists like Propertius and Tibullus, what do they tell us?
Their love poetry, often centered on relationships with mistresses rather than wives, provides fascinating insights into Roman social attitudes towards illicit affairs and the complexities of love outside marriage. Tibullus's first book, for example, is quite revealing about relationships with both women and boys.
In Ovid, author of the Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, he sounds like trouble.
Ovid is notorious. His witty and often provocative poems on seduction and love affairs, particularly the Ars Amatoria, were so controversial they're often cited as contributing to his exile by Emperor Augustus, who was trying to promote more traditional morals. His Metamorphoses also explores themes of transformation, often through stories involving, frankly, rape and sexual violence, which is a recurring theme in mythology.
For sheer raw detail, the epigrammatist Martial seems indispensable. He pops up everywhere in the source material.
Martial is absolutely essential for understanding daily life and attitudes towards sex across different levels of society. His short, punchy poems are incredibly explicit, full of humor, insult, and sharp observation. He writes about everything: brothels, prostitutes, specific sex acts, body parts. He offers a real street-level view. The sources refer to dozens and dozens of his epigrams for specific examples.
And Juvenal, the satirist, always railing against the times.
Juvenal offers a critical, often highly moralizing perspective, condemning what he saw as the degeneracy of Roman society, particularly its sexual mores. His satires, like the famous Satire 6 on women, provide a biased, certainly, but still valuable picture of perceived sexual excess and anxieties.
Beyond literature, what about art? You mentioned it wasn't hidden away. Any specific examples?
Right. While we've obviously lost a lot, finds like the paintings from the suburban baths at Pompeii provide incredible, explicit visual evidence. You see really diverse sex acts depicted different positions: oral sex, group sex involving men and women, men, and even women and women. It's quite startling.
So this wasn't just like fantasy art. It reflects a real visual culture.
It seems so. And some decor was specifically linked to function. The sources mention the poet Horace having a mirrored room, presumably for enhancing the visual experience of sex. Emperor Tiberius reportedly decorated his private rooms on Capri with highly explicit art and sculptures, and kept Greek sex manuals like those by Elephantis nearby.
Interestingly, the sources note a big shift later on, though. This openness didn't last.
No. Around the 3rd century AD, the kind of explicit discussion and depiction of sexuality seen in earlier literature largely disappears, outside of, say, medical or theological contexts. The rise of Christianity and its emphasis on celibacy as an ideal brought a fundamental change in attitudes towards the body and sex. You get early Christian writers like Tertullian and Clement debating the morality of even marital sex.
And stories of Christian martyrs often focused on sex.
Often focused on their chastity and depicted graphic sexual torture, particularly of women's bodies, like their breasts, as a way to emphasize their spiritual purity and resistance to pagan depravity. There's a brief, almost nostalgic return to obscene humor in the 4th century with the poet Ausonius, but even he signals a shift away from earlier norms like pederasty. The world was changing.
Okay, let's look at the deep connection between sex, religion, and the state in Rome. You said this was fundamental.
Absolutely fundamental. Roman religious practices, both public cult and private practice, actively supported and regulated sexuality. They saw it as essential to the well-being of the community, the fertility of the land, the success of the state.
How is that reflected in their gods?
Even the concepts of deities often included a male and female complement, like the Die Consentes, the Council of Gods. Some important state priesthoods were held jointly by married couples, symbolizing the necessary union of male and female in the spiritual realm for prosperity.
And the Vestal Virgins are a famous example of state-linked purity, aren't they?
A key example. Their vow of chastity was tied directly to the welfare of the state, guarding the sacred fire of Vesta, which symbolized Rome's continuity. They uniquely gained a degree of independence through this vow, and the sources note that among the sacred objects they kept was a sacred phallus, the fashionum, symbolizing male procreative power, alongside the female purity represented by Vesta's fire. It's a fascinating conjunction.
And violating that vow was serious business.
Extremely serious. Punishment was severe entombment for the Vestal, execution for any male partner involved. It was a profound religious violation.
But male priests weren't celibate.
No, generally not. Male priests in the major colleges were typically expected to marry and raise families. Cicero actually saw the libido, the desire to procreate through marriage and establishing a household, a domus, as the very seedbed of the Republic. Procreation was a civic duty.
Some festivals sound pretty wild, incorporating sexual themes.
They definitely did include openly sexual elements. The Lupercalia involved fertility rites, including whipping women with goat hides. The Floralia, honoring the goddess Flora, featured performances by nude actresses or mimes. April festivals often acknowledged or incorporated prostitutes into the celebrations.
And specific deities were linked to sex.
Oh, yes. Cupid, obviously. Priapus with his giant phallus. Mutunus Tutunus, another phallic deity associated with marriage. Liber, the god of wine and freedom, who also oversaw physiological responses during sex and was a patron for young men assuming the toga virilis and acquiring sexual libertas or freedom. There was a whole host of minor deities associated with intercourse, conception, childbirth.
And mythology and art weren't shy about depicting divine sex.
Not at all. Gods and goddesses were often depicted having sex in ways that were very human, sometimes erotic, sometimes humorous, sometimes quite violent, reflecting the full spectrum of human experience projected onto the divine.
Let's look at some specific Roman legal and moral concepts around sex.
Yeah.
What did castitas mean exactly?
Castitas meant purity, often with a religious dimension, like the purity required for certain rites, but it could refer to sexual purity as well. It's a bit distinct from pudicus, which was more specifically about being sexually moral or chaste. Goddesses like Ceres and Vesta embodied castitas. There are myths, like that of Tarpeia, involving violations of this kind of purity.
And incestum. You said it sounds more serious than just incest.
It was. Incestum is better understood as sacrilege or religious pollution. While it certainly included incestuous relationships, which violated religious law, it also covered other acts that were seen as polluting the sacred realm. The most famous example is Clodius Pulcher dressing as a woman and sneaking into the all-female rites of the Bona Dea. He was charged with incestum for that sacrilege.
Okay, stuprum. That sounds like a really important legal concept.
Stuprum is absolutely key. It's a broad term meaning illicit sexual intercourse, sex crime, or criminal debauchery. It encompassed a whole range of offenses, including things like incestum, rape, raptus, and adultery with certain individuals.
And initially it was just general disgrace, but it became specifically sexual.
Yes, originally it might have meant any disgraceful act, but by the time of Plautus in the early Republic, it had acquired a specific sexual meaning. What's absolutely crucial is that stuprum could only occur among citizens. It was fundamentally seen as a violation of the unique legal rights and protections from sexual misconduct that Roman citizens possessed, distinguishing them from non-citizens or slaves whose bodies weren't similarly protected by law.
So the act itself, the crime, was defined by the status of the people involved. That's very Roman.
Precisely. The verb form, stuprare, is transitive, requiring a male agent, stuprator, performing the act upon someone, usually another citizen whose rights were violated. This reflects the active male role inherent in the legal definition of the crime against citizen status and bodily integrity.
And raptus. That sounds like rape.
Raptus specifically meant unlawful taking, often by force, and in a sexual context, it meant unlawful sex by force. This is the Roman legal term that comes closest to our concept of rape, encompassing the abduction and violation of women and sometimes men.
Beyond the legal framework, people sought help for sexual reproductive issues, right? Often blending medicine, religion, and, well, what we might call magic.
Yes, the lines were incredibly blurred. People sought divine aid, maybe through prayers or leaving votive offerings. Models of body parts like breasts, penises, or uteruses have been found at healing sanctuaries, hoping the deity would cure an ailment or grant fertility.
And magic spells, like love potions.
Definitely. Magic, often intertwined with religious practices, included things like amatorium, which could be a love charm or potion, and defixiones, which were binding spells, often inscribed on lead tablets, intended to influence someone's affections or even their sexual function for good or ill. The Greek magical papyri, found in Roman Egypt, show there was a significant market for these services, often provided by freelance priests or magicians. Horace even describes the witch Canidia using effigies and potent ingredients for magical influence in his satires.
This sounds very close to early pharmacology, really. Aphrodisiacs, contraceptive.
Exactly. The sources for aphrodisiacs and aphrodisiacs to reduce desire, contraceptives, and abortifacients appear in both medical handbooks and texts involving magic. For the Romans, it was often a single spectrum of manipulating the body and its desires through various potent substances and rituals.
The sources give some truly wild examples from Marcellus of Bordeaux's medical book, De Medicamentis.
Oh, they're memorable, aren't they? For instance, a ritual prescribed for ensuring a wife's fidelity involved Cutting off a live green lizard's tail with your left thumbnail and touching the woman with it during sex while reciting a charm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And another one involved turning a boy into a eunuch.
Yes. A recipe using pounded nymphaea root, water lily,
Yeah.
drunken vinegar, which Marcellus claimed would turn a boy into a eunuch so that he cannot engage in intercourse. Whether it worked is another question.
And things like honey and pepper on the penis for erection, or boiling ass's genitals in oil for some remedy.
Yes, these are all documented remedies from various sources, showing the wide range of practices from sympathetic magic like the lizard tail to herbalism to things that just sound bizarre or frankly unpleasant to us today. They tried everything.
Shifting back a bit to how Romans thought about sex, there were theories, right? Mainly among the educated elite.
Right. The actual impact of these philosophical or medical theories on daily behavior is always debated, but they tell us how some elite Romans intellectualized sex, often quite critically, actually.
The Stoics are highlighted for criticizing the double standard between men and women.
They are. Stoics like Musonius Rufus and Seneca the Younger argued quite strongly against the commonly accepted idea that men had broad sexual freedom while respectable women were severely restricted. Their point, though, wasn't really about freedom for women in our sense, but about restraint for both sexes.
How so?
Their argument was that if men claimed authority based on their self-control, their virtus, then they must apply that control consistently to their own sex drive, too. It was about logical consistency and self-mastery for the man.
So, Musonius felt sex, even within marriage, should ideally be for procreation or expressing affection, not just bare pleasure.
Yes. And importantly, for Muthonius, a man using a prostitute wasn't primarily wrong because it disrespected his wife, though that might be a factor, but because it demonstrated his own lack of discipline and self-control. Similarly, exploiting a female slave sexually was wrong, primarily because of the master's self-indulgence, his failure to control his desires, not because of any concept of the slave's inherent rights.
That's a very different moral framework, focused on the actor's self-mastery.
Yeah.
And then there's Marcus Aurelius's rather clinical description of sex.
Right, the Stoic emperor famously dismissed sex in his meditations as just the friction of a piece of gut, and after a spasm, the expulsion of some mucus. Not exactly romantic, it reflects a Stoic effort to deflate the importance of physical pleasure and view bodily functions with detachment.
Let's dive deeper into male sexuality, which the sources link really strongly to dominance, status, and surprisingly, a lot of anxiety.
A key concept here, again, is libertas. For a Roman citizen, political liberty wasn't just abstract. It included the protection of his body from coercion or abuse. Being truly a man, having virtus, was tied to taking an active role in all aspects of life, and this translated directly into the primary role for masculine sexual behavior. Be the penetrator. Maintain control.
So dominance in sex mirrored the patriarchal social hierarchy. It was performative.
Absolutely. It was part of what some scholars call a conquest mentality and a cult of virility, especially shaping male-male interactions. The penetrator-penetrated model is crucial here. It was proper, expected, for a free man to insert his penis. Being penetrated, allowing his body to be used passively, was seen as threatening his libertas, his personal autonomy, and his integrity as a free citizen.
And this created anxiety, you said, especially later in the imperial period.
Yes. The sources suggest that anxieties about losing political liberty under the emperor's increasing, sometimes arbitrary, power were sometimes expressed through a perceived increase in passive homosexual behavior among free men. This loss of physical integrity, the citizen's body becoming potentially vulnerable, like a slave's, to the state's power, seemed to be mirrored in these sexual anxieties about passivity.
Okay, let's get into some specific aspects of male sexuality the sources highlight. Male nudity, for example. How was that viewed?
Generally, male nudity in Rome had negative connotations, unlike in Greece. It was associated with defeat, and war capitals were often stripped naked, and with slavery, slaves were displayed naked for sale. The disapproval wasn't necessarily about suppressing desire, but about marking the citizen body as free, dignified, and distinct from the vulnerability of slaves or enemies.
But we do see statues of emperors and generals depicted nude later on.
Yes, with increasing Greek influence, especially in the late Republican Empire, the heroic nude became more common in art. depicting generals or emperors in the guise of Hellenistic kings or even gods. This was initially quite shocking in the Republic because it evoked royalty or divinity, which clashed with Republican ideals of citizen equality. But under Augustus and later emperors, nudity in official art became more complex in its symbolism and more accepted for the elite.
Roman sexuality is often described as phallocentric. The phallus seems everywhere.
The phallus was absolutely central, both physically and symbolically. The phallus symbol, the fascinum, was widely used as an apotropaic amulet, basically, a good luck charm to ward off evil or bad luck. You see them on buildings as pendants and famously in wind chimes, the tintinnabula, often quite elaborate. Some scholars even see phallic symbolism in Roman architecture, like the layout of the Forum Augustum.
And the god Priapus. He's hard to miss.
Priapus, with his famously oversized, permanently erect phallus, was a figure of rustic fertility, often depicted in gardens. He embodied a mix of humor, grotesqueness, but also protective power. His image was used to ward off thieves, often with explicit threats of sexual violation, anal rape usually. There's a whole collection of poems, the Priapia, supposedly in his voice, full of phallic humor and threats. Even military equipment, like sling bullets found from the siege of Perugia, have been found inscribed with phallic imagery and obscenities directed at the enemy. And the sources give us a whole range of Latin words for the penis, from the clinical penis to the more common mentula and the quite vulgar verpa or muto.
There was also a particular fascination with testicles, wasn't there?
Yes, a really fascinating connection, etymologically and culturally, between tests, testicles, and testis, a witness. This might stem from very ancient Near Eastern practices where binding oaths were sworn while holding the swearer's genitals, essentially putting a curse upon one's lineage and future if they swore falsely. Latin writers loved making puns on this connection, implying you literally needed balls to be a legally functioning male citizen who could give witness in court. The sources mention both proper terms like testiculus, the diminutive, and obscene words like coleus.
Castration was legally prohibited by the Lex Cornelia, but it still happened.
Yes, despite the law, it was practiced, especially on beautiful young male slaves called deliciae, to preserve their youthful appearance and androgynous appeal, preventing puberty. Emperor Nero notoriously had his favorite freedman, Sporus, castrated, and then went through a marriage ceremony with him. Archaeological finds include castration clamps, which might have been used by the self-castrating priests of the goddess Cybele, or perhaps by veterinarians.
And there were theories about regulating semen. A belief it could weaken you.
Yes, there was a widespread belief, going back to Greek medical thought, that too frequent ejaculation weakened men, depleted their vital energy. Medical theories recommended therapies involving cooling, drying, or astringents, like taking cold baths, to counteract the heat associated with sexual arousal and conserve semen.
Galen had a specific theory.
The influential physician Galen theorized that semen was derived from blood and contained pneuma, a vital spirit or energy. Losing semen meant losing this vital pneuma, leading to a loss of physical and mental vigor, acuity, and even masculinity, including a strong, manly voice.
So orators or singers were actually told to abstain.
Yes. The famous teacher of rhetoric, Quintilian, advised orators to practice sexual abstinence for vocal strength. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, about Catullus's friend Calvus using lead plates worn on his hips at night to prevent nocturnal emissions, supposedly based on medical theories about cold preventing arousal. Medical texts also offered treatments for conditions like satyriasis, excessive desire, priapism, persistent erection, and involuntary seminal discharge. Control was paramount.
Effeminacy was a huge insult, wasn't it? Particularly in politics.
A very common and potent political accusation, often directed at popular politicians perceived as non-traditional, like Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, or figures like Clodius Pulcher. They might be accused of being overly concerned with their appearance, grooming, clothing, or worse, of being willing to take the passive role in sex with men. Paradoxically, these same figures were often simultaneously accused of being womanizers and dangerously sexually appealing.
And actual cross-dressing appears in the sources.
Yes, most notoriously with Clodius Pulcher again, dressing as a woman to infiltrate the all-female Bona Dea rites, which led to his prosecution for incestum. It also appears as a trope in mythology. The story of Hercules dressed as a woman serving Queen Omphale was a popular subject in art. And significantly, it was part of religious practice for the Galli, the priests of the goddess Cybele.
The galleys were castrated and wore women's clothing, right?
They were. Their dramatic self-castration and adoption of female attire and mannerisms blurred gender lines significantly, and they are sometimes seen by modern scholars as constituting a kind of transgender priesthood in antiquity. Catullus's powerful poem, Carmen 63, explores the traumatic experience and complex identity of Attis, a follower of Cybele. Outside of this religious context, references to transvestism are rare and ambiguous. Legal texts mention a man wearing women's clothes might risk scorn. Seneca the Elder discusses a mock trial involving the bang rape of a young man who was cross-dressed as a prostitute, but frames it as a drunken dare, not related to gender identity or erotic preference.
Okay, let's tackle male-male sex head-on. What was the basic Roman view?
Okay, here's that key Roman distinction again, based on role and status. For a freeborn Roman man, having sex with lower status males, slaves, prostitutes, foreigners, even freeborn boys, before they assumed the toga virilis and full citizenship rights, was generally acceptable and could even reinforce his masculine prestige as long as he took the active, penetrating role.
So the passive role was the absolute problem for a free man.
Absolutely. Taking the passive role, being penetrated, associated with the figure of the senatus, was deeply disparaged as weak, effeminate, and servile. It was often linked in Roman thought to the perceived stigma around performing oral sex as well. The active, penetrating position was seen as proof of masculinity, reflecting the physical mastery over others that was considered an aspect of a citizen's libertas. Allowing your body to be subjugated sexually was seen as degrading, a mark of servility like a slave.
There were laws against this, though, weren't there?
Yes, laws like the Lex Scantinia, though its exact provisions are debated, and later Augustan legislation aimed to restrict same-sex activity. But the focus seems to have been primarily on preventing freeborn males from taking the passive role, or perhaps on protecting freeborn youths from seduction by adult males. Why? Because a freeborn man willingly taking the passive role for another free man was seen as fundamentally threatening the integrity of the freeborn status, undermining that essential libertas.
And that ties back to the anxieties about losing political liberty under the emperors.
It seems to. The sources suggest a link between the perceived rise of passive behavior among free men in the imperial era and the broader cultural anxiety about the loss of political autonomy and the citizens' vulnerability to the emperor's power. The literary examples we have from poets like Catullus, Tibullus, and Propertius explore a wide range of erotic relationships, including intense emotional and physical connections with boys, often framing them within this status dynamic.
Why would elite men sometimes prefer relationships with boys over women? Did the sources comment on that?
Yes, some sources, like the poet Martial, note somewhat cynically that relationships with boys of lower status or slaves lacked the complex legal and familial complications, things like dowry negotiations, inheritance issues, adultery laws that came with relationships with women of similar elite status. Even the emotional demands were seen as different. The sulks or pride of a boy were perhaps preferred over dealing with a wife's family or property concerns.
Were there even mentions of marriage between men?
Yes, though often satirically. Juvenal and Martial mock the idea. But the historian Suetonius reports Emperor Nero formally marrying two different men in public ceremonies, once playing the role of the bride, with Sporus, whom he had castrated, and once as the groom. This highlights a degree of, well, behavioral fluidity or imperial eccentricity that existed before later Christian condemnation became legally codified, for instance in the Codex Theodosianus in 342 AD, which prescribed harsh penalties. Figures like eunuchs and known passive males, senati, could be officially branded infamies, losing legal rights and social standing.
What about the rape of men? Was that recognized or discussed?
Our sources indicate that male victims of rape feature with surprising frequency, sometimes discussed almost equally with female victims, in collections of historical examples like Valerius Maximus. Seneca the Elder's rhetorical exercises, the mock trials, include scenarios that assume the legal prosecution of gang rape against a young free man, adolescents. One hypothetical case even discusses the suicide of a freeborn male rape victim. The rape of a freeborn man, ingenuus, was considered one of the worst crimes, sometimes listed alongside parricide or temple robbery.
But rape was also mentioned as a punishment. That seems contradictory.
It does. It's sometimes mentioned, perhaps more in theory or as a revenge fantasy, as a traditional, though likely illegal punishment inflicted by a wronged husband against a male adulterer caught in the act, usually involving anal rape. Also, the threat of anal or oral rape, irrumatio, was a very common and aggressive form of invective and masculine braggadocio in literature, most famously used by Catullus in Carmen 16, peccabo ica vos et irrumabo.
Sex in the military sounds like it was particularly strictly regulated.
Very strict, yes. Homosexual behavior among soldiers, specifically between freeborn citizen soldiers, was subject to severe penalties, potentially including the fustuarium, a ritual clubbing to death by one's fellow soldiers as described by the historian Polybius. Why? Because it was seen as a profound violation of military discipline and decorum. A soldier maintained his masculinity and status by ensuring his body was not used sexually, especially by a peer.
This distinguished them from slaves again, protecting their bodily integrity.
Exactly. Roman soldiers, uniquely among citizens, were regularly subjected to corporal punishment by their superiors, something usually reserved for slaves. Maintaining sexual integrity, not allowing one's body to be penetrated, helped distinguish the soldier who sacrificed some aspects of civilian autonomy for military service from the total physical vulnerability of the slave. Conversely, rape committed during warfare against defeated enemies symbolized their complete subjugation and loss of status. There's a famous story in Plutarch about a soldier named Trebonius who killed his superior officer, Lucius, for attempting to rape him. Trebonius was acquitted and even crowned for his bravery in defending his sexual integrity.
So for men, it seems overwhelmingly about status, control, the active versus passive role, and protecting the integrity and freedom, the libertas, of the citizen body. Let's shift now to female sexuality. How is that framed?
Okay, the focus shifts dramatically here. Female sexuality in Roman thought was seen primarily, almost exclusively, through the lens of the family and the state. It was considered a basis for social order and state prosperity, expected to be contained and managed within legitimate marriage for the purpose of producing legitimate citizen children. Women were honored for pudicitia, chastity modesty, and fecundity. Emperor Augustus even introduced rewards, the idius trium liberorum, for women who had 3 or more children. Controlling female sexuality, particularly through institutions like the Vestal Virgins, was seen as absolutely essential for state stability. Any disorderly female sexuality, or conversely exemplary female virtue, could be seen as impacting state religious well-being, especially in times of crisis.
How were female body parts depicted or discussed? Let's start with genitals.
Female genitals, unlike the often celebrated phallus, frequently appear as objects of disgust or ridicule in Roman invective and satire. They are rarely described in positive or appreciative terms in love poetry, though Ovid is something of an exception, occasionally mentioning female pleasure or anatomy. Martial, for instance, uses crude comparisons like comparing a woman's genitals to the loose gullet of a pelican. The vagina was sometimes compared unfavorably to a boy's anus as a receptacle for male penetration. Art sometimes shows depilation of the pubic area. The sources list various Latin words like the common but vulgar cunis, the more formal vulva, or the euphemistic sinus, fold or lap. There were also offensive terms for pubic hair. Racialized stereotypes existed too, with the genitals of black women sometimes being described stereotypically by Roman writers as excessively hairy or large.
What about breasts? Were they a major focus of erotic interest?
Breasts, mammae, or the diminutive papillae for nipples, were certainly noted, especially nipples, papillae, in erotic contexts by poets like Catullus and the Augustan elegists. The ideal seems to have been relatively small, unobtrusive breasts, sometimes compared to apples. Martial mocks women with large breasts. Old women's breasts were stereotypically described as pendulous. We know male actors playing female roles in comedy wore costumes with exaggerated breasts. However, the sources suggest that, compared perhaps to modern Western culture, Roman poets and artists showed somewhat limited interest in breasts as a primary erotic focus. They were observed more as a feature of overall beauty or form. Ovid finds them inviting to touch. Catullus links a bride's nipples suggestively to future fidelity and family. Votive offerings shaped like breasts are found at healing sanctuaries, suggesting concerns about health or lactation. Breast-bearing and beating were gestures of mourning for women. Gallic women were described as bearing their breasts in supplication to Roman soldiers. In explicit art, breasts are sometimes covered by a breastband called a strophium, even when the rest of the body is nude. Their erogenous power is noted in a Greek novel popular in Rome. Propertius links breast development to girls playing, and Tibullus describes the erotic effect of breasts flashing through loose clothing at a dinner party. There was even an astrological tradition that discussed mammary intercourse. So it's a mixed picture present, noted, sometimes eroticized, but perhaps less central than the phallus was for male identity.
Female sex, as we noted before, is poorly documented in the literature we have.
Very limited literary evidence, yeah. It appears most clearly in visual art, like that foursome painting from the Pompeii suburban baths, which depicts 2 women together alongside 2 men. There's one ambiguous literary reference, possibly in Martial, using an equestrian metaphor, writing, that might describe lesbian sex, but it's debated. The male authors just didn't write about it much.
And rape of women.
Mythology is absolutely full of rape themes, particularly in Ovid's Metamorphoses, where gods frequently rape mortals. Legally, as we mentioned, raptus meant unlawful taking by force and included the rape of women. The rape of a freeborn virgin was considered a capital crime because it violated her status and the rights of her family. Rape and the complex legalities around consent and status were also discussed under the broader concept of stuprum, highlighting the violation of citizen rights and family honor.
Let's look specifically at sexuality in children. Roman society had specific practices and protections, but also dangers for young people.
Yes, children wore protective amulets against harm, including sexual predators. Boys wore a bulla, a locket usually containing charms, often including a phallic talisman, the fashionum. This amulet served a dual purpose: general protection against evil, but also as a visible sign that the boy was freeborn and therefore sexually off limits to predatory adult males. Girls wore a similar amulet called a lunula, shaped like a crescent moon.
There were specific laws protecting freeborn children.
Yes. The rape of a freeborn boy was a capital crime, again seen primarily as protecting the integrity and future potential of the citizen body. Even a poet boasting in fiction about seducing a young freeborn boy could face damaging character attacks if brought up in a real court case. Valerius Maximus gives an example. Cicero, in his prosecution of Verres, considers Verres' associate Apronius dancing naked at a dinner party in front of a pure praetextatus, a boy still wearing the bordered toga signifying his youth and protected status, to be one of the worst possible offenses, showing profound disrespect.
Children even attended adult dinner parties at convivia. That sounds potentially exposing.
They sometimes did, yes, theoretically, to observe and learn proper adult social behavior. However, the educator Quintilian famously criticized parents who were poor role models, flaunting mistresses or male lovers, and allowing drunken or age-inappropriate talk in front of their children. On the other hand, there were contexts where children were expected to engage in suggestive talk at weddings. Boys traditionally had license to shout obscene verses, Thessalonian verses, believed to promote fertility through humor and by warding off evil spirits.
The sources mention a really important story linking debt slavery and attempted sexual abuse, leading to a major legal change.
Yes, this incident vividly illustrates the Roman concept of the citizen body's inviolability. Before the Lex Potilia Papiria abolished the harshest form of debt bondage, known as nexum, free Romans could essentially fall into a form of temporary slavery if they couldn't repay a debt. The historian Livy recounts how this system was supposedly ended, around 326 BC, because of the attempted sexual abuse of a beautiful freeborn boy, Gaius Publilius.
What happened to him?
Publilius was serving as surety, nexus, for his father's debt, when he refused the sexual demands of the creditor, a man named Lucius Papirius. Papirius had him stripped and brutally whipped. The boy escaped and displayed his injuries publicly in the forum, causing such a massive public outcry against the nexum system that it led directly to the passage of the Lex Potilia Papiria.
Wow. So that specific incident cemented the idea that a citizen's body was fundamentally free from that kind of violation, even for debt.
Exactly. That law essentially declared that a debtor's property, not their physical person, should be the collateral for loans. It established the principle of the physical integrity of the citizen's body as fundamental to their libertas, their political freedom and status. It starkly contrasted this protected status with the slave's inherent vulnerability to corporal punishment and sexual abuse, which were seen by Romans as similar kinds of violations of bodily freedom and dignity. Valerius Maximus tells a similar story reinforcing this principle.
Bringing it all together now, let's look at sex, marriage, and society in context. Marital sex, was it really just seen as a duty for having babies?
It's often assumed that Roman men didn't expect much sexual satisfaction in marriage because they had access to prostitutes, slaves, or other partners. But the sources actually push back on this. While producing legitimate children was certainly a primary goal, and jurists like Ulpian stressed that marital affection, affectio maritalis, rather than intercourse itself legally defined a marriage, the fact that moralists frequently warned against couples becoming too preoccupied with sexual pleasure within marriage suggests that marital passion was indeed possible and perhaps common. Companionship and shared pleasure were seen as enhancing the marriage bond, especially in long marriages that continued past childbearing years. Pliny the Younger wrote letters to his wife Calpurnia using the passionate rhetoric usually found in love poetry addressed to mistresses.
And there's even a mythological trope for wedded sex.
Yes, the relationship between the Trojan hero Hector and his wife Andromache was sometimes invoked. Interestingly, the woman on top position, mulier equitans, was sometimes humorously referred to as riding the Hector horse, linking it to this respected married couple. Paintings found in Roman houses, like those from the Casa della Farnesina, have been interpreted as depicting the different roles of a woman within marriage, perhaps shifting from a modest bride to a more confident and active lover over time.
Fidelity and adultery sound like they were very much defined by a double standard.
Massively so. A Roman man did not legally commit adultery simply by having sex outside his marriage, as long as his partner was considered sexually available, that is, generally not another Roman citizen's wife, unmarried daughter under her father's authority, or a freeborn youth under protection. Adulterium, the crime of adultery, was primarily defined by the female partner's status. It meant having sex with a married Roman woman.
So it was fundamentally about violating another man's rights over the woman in his family.
Fundamentally, yes. It was seen as an offense against the paterfamilias' authority and the purity of his lineage. Emperor Augustus's major social legislation, the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis around 18 BC, formally criminalized adultery for married women and their partners, making it a public crime rather than just a private family matter. This was part of his broader program to restore traditional morals, most may Rome, and consolidate his own authority after the chaos of the civil wars, reinforcing social hierarchy. There's ongoing debate among historians whether this law addressed a real perceived crisis in morals or was primarily an instrument of social control, extending the state's reach into private life. And personal anxiety about fidelity certainly existed, as evidenced by magic spells designed to ensure a partner's faithfulness, or even interrogate them magically if suspected.
Master-slave relations are called a core feature of slavery in the sources. Sex was inherent to that power imbalance.
Absolutely. Because slaves were legally property, things, a master had virtually absolute power over his slaves' bodies, including near unfettered sexual access. This power existed largely outside state or social control, within the realm of the domus. As the scholar Eva Cantarella bluntly put it, there was little preventing a Roman master from routinely sodomizing his houseboys if he wished. Marshall writes about preferring slave boys for quick relief as being cheaper than masturbation, though less erotically engaging than pursuing freeborn youths. Slaves often appear in the background or as attendants in erotic art.
The dream interpreter Artemidorus even commented on this.
Yes, he interpreted dreaming of having sex with one's own female slave as simply meaning the dreamer would be pleased with his possessions. It reflects that objectification. An owner even had the legal right to claim ownership of a free woman if she had a sustained affair with his male slave.
What about relationships between free women and male slaves? Was that common or discussed?
It's mentioned much less frequently in the surviving literature, which is overwhelmingly written by elite men. When it does appear, it's often in the context of scandal or accusation, for example. The trumped-up charges of affairs with slaves used against Emperor Nero's wife, Claudia Octavia. Or it might appear as innuendo against a husband who failed to properly control his household. Despite their lack of agency, slaves themselves were often stereotypically portrayed in art and literature, especially Roman comedy, as inherently lascivious, voyeuristic, or sexually opportunistic. The contrast between the protected body of the citizen, as established by laws like the Lex Potilia Papiria, and the total vulnerability of the slave is absolutely key to understanding Roman social structure.
Prostitution was legal and widespread, you said. Who are the prostitutes?
Yes, legal throughout the Republican Empire. Most prostitutes were slaves, or former slaves, freed women. They were supposed to be registered with the local officials, the aediles. The jurist Ulpian noted that notorious promiscuity itself could legally confer the status of a prostitute, which significantly exempted a woman from being prosecuted under the adultery laws.
Wait, so some socially prominent women actually registered as prostitutes?
Bizarrely, yes. Some sources suggest that women from elite families sometimes did this deliberately, registering as prostitutes to avoid the harsh penalties of Augustus's adultery law if they wanted to have affairs. It highlights the legalistic, status-based nature of Roman sexual regulation. The status of prostitutes could be confusing. In comedies by Plautus and Terence, the prostitute character often turns out to be a freeborn woman who was kidnapped or lost as a child, allowing for a respectable marriage at the end.
How are prostitutes depicted in art or identified in life?
Art, like the famous paintings from the brothel, Lupanar, in Pompeii, shows prostitutes in various explicit poses, often nude except perhaps for the strophium breastband. Some scholars note the positions depicted contradict claims made in ancient medical texts about prostitutes avoiding pregnancy. In daily life, prostitutes were sometimes expected or required to wear distinctive clothing, perhaps gaudy silk garments, or, paradoxically, the toga. The toga was a symbol of male Roman citizenship, and prostitutes were among the only Roman women permitted or perhaps required to wear it, marking them as publicly available and crossing gender boundaries.
Prostitutes and others suffered from infamia. What did that mean?
Infamia was an official loss of legal standing and social repute. It applied to prostitutes, pimps, and generally anyone who used their bodies publicly for the pleasure of others. This included performers like actors, actresses, dancers, and gladiators. They were seen as objects of desire who served the pleasure of others and thus tarnished by the public gaze and lacking full civic rights. They were liable to corporal punishment, normally reserved for slaves. Citizen performers were excluded from the physical protections usually afforded citizens. Gladiators even took an oath accepting branding, bondage, and beating.
Yet gladiators were sexually alluring.
Paradoxically, yes. Despite their low status and brutal profession, gladiators held a powerful, dangerous sexual allure for some Roman women, and perhaps men. Actors were also seen as sexually ambiguous, skilled at imitating women, and often considered attractive to both sexes. We have accounts of affairs between prominent Romans, like Sulla or Maecenas, and actors, and even imperial women were rumored to have affairs with them. Actresses were generally just assumed to be prostitutes. Men known for taking the passive sexual role, Scenati, could also be declared infamies. Juvenal vividly contrasts stern, dirty virtue with soft, effeminate, perfumed pleasure lurking in dubious places.
And were there actual private sex clubs or parties?
The evidence suggests so. Archaeology, especially in Pompeii and Herculaneum, reveals some luxurious private houses, domus, with rooms decorated with highly explicit art, sometimes with separate external entrances, suggesting spaces designed perhaps to evoke a brothel ambience for exclusive private parties. Literary sources also describe scandalous elite gatherings. Valerius Maximus tells of a party hosted by a man named Gemellus, attended by a consul and tribunes, where notable married women and an aristocratic boy were allegedly prostituted in a game of drunken sex, leading to an indictment. These kinds of stories certainly formed the basis for political smears, like the lurid tales about Emperor Caligula supposedly running a brothel on the Palatine Hill using married women and freeborn youths.
Let's get into the specifics of sex acts and positions mentioned in the sources. Those mysterious spintriae tokens first.
Yes, these small bronze or brass tokens, mostly found near Rome and Pompeii, depict various explicit sex acts on one side, often with a number on the other. Their exact function is still hotly debated. Were they brothel tokens, gaming pieces, tickets, something else entirely? They definitely show a wide range of sexual activities was visually represented.
Suetonius mentions Emperor Tiberius had quite the collection of sex manuals and art.
He does, yes. Suetonius claims Tiberius had books by Elephantis, a Greek author of sex manuals, and decorated his bedroom with paintings and sculptures depicting erotic scenes, including, supposedly, one showing Atalanta performing oral sex on Meleager during a hunt. This highlights the visual and even instructional aspects of sex in some elite circles. Lucretius, the philosopher, even discussed the perceived purposes of different positions, suggesting prostitutes used movements designed for pleasure and avoiding pregnancy, while wives seeking conception should remain relatively still and perhaps use rear entry positions, more forarum, like animals, to aid conception.
What about the basic language for male-female intercourse?
The basic, straightforward, and generally obscene verb was futuo, meaning I fuck. It wasn't used in polite literature like epic or philosophy, but appears frequently in graffiti, satire, and epigrams. It could be used transactionally, I paid to fuck, intimately, or simply as an expression of arousal. Sources mention wedding night words, nuptialia verba, suggesting some explicit language was expected in that context. There's a famous aggressive quote attributed to Mark Antony's wife Fulvia, aut futumi, aut pugnimus, either fuck me or let's fight. Pompeii graffiti uses the verb to boast of sexual prowess, record encounters, or advertise availability. Poets like Catullus and Martial sometimes describe the goal of shared climax, wanting both partners to be equally vanquished.
Miliar equitans, the woman riding position, was particularly popular in Roman art, you mentioned.
Very much so, noticeably more popular than in surviving Greek art. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, gives advice on which women look best in this position, suggesting petite women. The connection to Hector and Andromache gave it the nickname the Hector horse. A relief carving from Gaul depicts a couple in this position but uses the metaphor of a galloping horse. Variations existed, like Venus pendula conversa, woman leaning back, or Venus pendula aversa, woman facing away, which was rare but found in some exotic nilotic scenes. Interestingly, the equestrian metaphor of riding was also sometimes applied to male-male anal sex, the passive partner as the rider, and possibly even to female-female sex, taking turns riding.
Anal sex seems frequently mentioned, especially in invective and threats.
Pedicare, to bugger or sodomize, usually implied a male object, and was a blunt, often threatening term used most famously by Capellus in Carmen 16 as an aggressive insult. Calis was the basic, somewhat coarse word for anus, with metaphors like ficus, fig, sometimes used, or the more decorous medical term anus, ring. Men who took the passive role were described with phrases like mulibria pati, to suffer womanly things. When a woman received anal sex, it might be described as playing the boy's role. Martial taunts his wife by saying he prefers boys' tighter anuses. A specific position called the lioness, figura veneris, seen in art, possibly depicted anal sex, especially with boys in Greek art, although it can be hard to distinguish from vaginal rear entry, a tergo, with women. A prostitute specializing in anal sex might be called a kulibonia, good ass. Avoiding pregnancy was likely a major motive for prostitutes engaging in anal sex.
Us impurum, unclean mouth, oral sex carried a strong stigma, particularly for the male performer.
Yes, performing oral sex, especially cunnilingus, seems to have carried a particular stigma for a Roman man, often associated with effeminacy or subservience and leading to mockery. Cunnilingus depicted in art is often reciprocal, part of a 69 position. However, there's a unique and famous painting from Pompeii showing a striking role reversal. A man performs cunnilingus on a tall, shapely, confidently posed woman. The man is depicted as small, crouching, clothed, and looking anxious or furtive. It's likely intended as humorous and transgressive because it reverses the expected power dynamic. On the other hand, itermatio, forced male-on-male oral sex, forcing the penis into someone's mouth, was used as a threat, a form of invective and masculine braggadocio, again notoriously by Catullus in Carmen 16, alongside the threat of anal rape.
Group sex appears in various sources, too. It wasn't just Tiberius.
No, it appears in literary sources, graffiti, and art. Suetonius does describe Tiberius's alleged invention of the spintriae, perhaps linking the tokens to group sex, and his enjoyment of orchestrating nexus, or chains, of intertwined boys and girls. Threesomes involving 2 men and 1 woman seem relatively common in depictions. Catullus, poem 56, even describes a scenario where he catches a man receiving anal sex from a boy while simultaneously penetrating a woman. Foursomes are also depicted, sometimes involving 2 male-female couples or same-sex pairs. The foursome painting from the Pompeii suburban baths is particularly discussed by scholars because the man who is being anally penetrated is arguably portrayed as the dominant victor, acting only for his own gratification and looking out defiantly at the viewer. The late Roman poet Ausonius wrote a riddle describing 3 men in bed where 2 are debauched, the answer being the man in the middle.
Masturbation seems much less noted or discussed in the sources.
Much less, yes. The left hand was sometimes specified, perhaps due to associations of the right hand with public life. Martial calls masturbation an inferior substitute for sex with a slave, which itself is inferior to an expensive boy, but admits to doing it himself when other options aren't available. A fragment from the satirist Lucilius mentions muto, a vulgar term for penis, and laeliva, left hand, together. A Pompeii graffito refers euphemistically to using the left hand to release pent-up fluids. The etymology of the Latin verb masturbare is debated, perhaps from manus stuprare, to defile with the hand, or involving turbare, to disturb, and mas, male, or even an older Indo-European root.
Bestiality is common in mythology, but did it happen in reality?
It's incredibly common in mythology. Gods frequently transformed into animals to have sex with humans. Zeus as a swan with Leda, Zeus as a bull with Europa, Pasiphae's affair with the Cretan bull resulting in the Minotaur. Satyrs, part man, part goat, were inherently linked to bestial urges. We hear of mock bestiality role-play in performances, like the dancer Bathyllus playing Leda seduced by the swan. Apuleius' novel The Golden Ass famously features the protagonist, transformed into a donkey, being desired by a wealthy matron.
An actual staged bestiality in the arena. That sounds horrific.
The sources do mention reenactments of myths like Pasiphae and the bull being staged in the Roman arena, often as a form of execution for condemned criminals. Both Martial and Apuleius describe such spectacles, though the practical logistics how they ensured the animal cooperated are debated, perhaps using artificial cow costumes or animal secretions, as suggested in Apuleius' fictional account. Emperor Nero reportedly dressed in animal skins himself and attacked the genitals of bound victims in the arena, mimicking wild beasts. One bizarre story tells of a prostitute hired to dress as a leopard for a senator's pleasure. So yes, it seems it moved beyond myth into some forms of entertainment and private practice.
Let's look briefly at hermaphroditism and androgyny. The figure of Hermaphroditus from mythology is central here.
Yes, Hermaphroditus, the son of Hermes and Aphrodite. Ovid's narrative in the Metamorphoses is the most famous version, a beautiful youth who rejected love until the nymph Salmacis became infatuated with him. When he bathed in her spring, she embraced him and prayed to the gods that they never be separated, and her wish was granted, their bodies merged into one being possessing both male and female characteristics. The water of her spring was thereafter said to make men who bathed in it soft with impudicitia, unchastity or effeminacy. This myth, like the related story of Hylas, abducted by nymphs, explores themes related to the ambiguous status and potential dangers faced by beautiful adolescent males transitioning to manhood.
The sources note that hermaphrodite wasn't necessarily a pejorative term in antiquity, unlike sometimes today.
Correct. While representing a transgression of norms, it wasn't necessarily used as an insult. The figure seemed to focus ancient attention on questions of gender identity and represented a violation of social boundaries that was fascinating rather than purely negative. Depictions of Hermaphroditus became very popular in Hellenistic and Roman art, perhaps because of the inherent visual drama, the double take required of the viewer, and the themes of sexual ambiguity and frustration it embodied.
Often shown interacting with the satyr. Why that combination?
Yes, that's a common motif. The satyr, representing primal, often crude and uninhibited sexuality, is frequently depicted encountering Hermaphroditus, sometimes attempting to excite him, only to be surprised or repulsed upon discovering Hermaphroditus's dual nature. This contrast likely added a layer of humor. In some depictions, Hermaphroditus actively wards off the satyr's advances, while in others, Hermaphroditus seems willing or inviting, even if the satyr is now less keen.
What did these artistic depictions explore, do scholars think?
The sources suggest they serve to highlight the ambiguities in sexual differences and even sexual acts themselves. Hermaphroditus offered an eternally ambiguous answer to the universal curiosity about the experience of the opposite sex. The figure could represent the physical and psychological impossibility of fully understanding a beloved's feelings. It was seen as a highly sophisticated artistic representation that invaded supposedly clear boundaries between the sexes.
Pliny the Elder mentioned androgyny as well.
Yes, using the Greek term and rod man, jinn woman, for people born with characteristics of both sexes. He noted that while such births were once considered frightening portents, prodigia, that might need religious expiation, in his own day, 1st century AD, individuals with androgynous features had become objects of delight, delicia, sometimes acquired at what he calls monsters markets.
But legally, there was no third gender category in Rome.
No. Despite the fascination in the existence of intersex individuals under Roman law, a person born with ambiguous genitalia had to be legally classified as either male or female, usually based on which characteristics predominated. There was no recognized third legal gender.
Finally, the sources mention sexual conquest being used as a metaphor for Roman imperialism.
Yes, the language of Roman expansion and domination over other peoples was often framed using metaphors of sexual conquest. Rome actively penetrating, subjugating, and dominating conquered lands or feminized foreign peoples.
But it wasn't always that straightforward. The metaphor could be complicated.
Not always, no. Poets like Horace, for example, wrote about how captive Greece, though militarily conquered by Rome, had in turn culturally captivated its conquerors, suggesting a kind of cultural colonization working in the opposite direction. And there are myths and stories where a male conqueror rapes or abducts a woman but then falls in love with her, like Achilles and Briseis, suggesting that the relationship between conqueror and conquered could be more complex, with the seemingly powerless party sometimes subtly transforming or captivating the dominant one.
Wow, that really was quite the deep dive into Roman sexuality. We covered so much ground, from their laws and gods to their art, magic, specific sexual practices, and even how they thought about children, slaves, gender itself.
It certainly reveals a world that was, in so many ways, incredibly different from our own. It really forces us to confront how fluid and yet how rigidly structured by status and role their ideas about sex, gender, and desire actually were.
We saw how sex was just deeply intertwined with everything: status, freedom, libertas, religion, political power, and that fundamental concept of what it meant to be a Roman citizen versus a slave or a non-citizen.
We got these insights through their own words, sometimes shockingly explicit words, their art, their buildings, their everyday objects, and their constant legal attempts to regulate behavior, whether it's the, eye-popping details from Martial, the paintings at Pompeii, the Vestal virgins guarding a sacred phallus, or that foundational law protecting a boy in debt bondage from sexual abuse.
This whole exploration really drives home how much our own understanding of sexuality is a product of our specific history and culture, doesn't it? Not some universal, unchanging truth.
Absolutely. It's profoundly shaped by context. So, maybe here's a thought to leave you with. If something as seemingly fundamental and innate as sexuality could be understood and lived out so fundamentally differently by a major influential civilization like Rome, what does it tell us about the categories, the norms, and the assumptions about gender, desire, relationships, and even bodily integrity that we often take for granted in our world today?